So our next speaker, again, we're extremely fortunate. And for our next speaker, we didn't even have to fly her in from far, far away. She is Elizabeth Fenn. She's Driscoll Professor of History here at UC Boulder. And Elizabeth, in 2015, she won a Pulitzer for her work on the Mandan people. And yet, one of her longstanding interests, and I believe even the topic of your thesis, your Ph.D. thesis, is that correct? Was Pax Americana, a history of smallpox in America. It's been an ongoing interest for her and was the subject of another very well-received book. And we're fortunate today to have her tell us about that. Welcome. Thank you.
That's not it. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's a real treat to be the historian at a symposium like this, and I want to reassure you, Anna, despite the fact that you passed up the chance to focus on history at Princeton, we get the last say. And all of this is history, and we will be writing about it someday. Now, but it's striking, too, how many times history has inflected the presentations we've had today. Julie's discussion of the evolution of resistance in bacteria and in viruses, Phyllis's longitudinal study, Larry's longitudinal study, that's all about history. So I am going to take you back many centuries. The events I'm going to describe to you today took place from 1775 to 1782, which, if you think back to your high school history classes, you may remember as almost exactly the years of the American Revolution. Now, rather than start at the beginning, I want to start with the aftermath. And I want you to envision the great British sea captain, George Vancouver, exploring the northwest coast of America in 1792. What he saw in the region around Vancouver Island disturbed him greatly. The land was abundant. It had a seemingly unlimited supply of salmon and fresh drinking water. But there were surprisingly few people. And instead, the navigator found deserted villages, overrun with weeds, and littered, he said, with human skulls and other bones. So all of the evidence, Vancouver believed, indicated, as he put it, that at no very remote period this country had been far more populous than at present. Now, in truth, even Vancouver could not have known the scope of the problem he had stumbled upon. There had indeed been a disaster. It was a disaster so vast that even its witnesses, even its victims, could not appreciate its extent. In the years from 1775 to 1782, as the Revolutionary War reshaped society and politics along the eastern seaboard, a very different cataclysm had shaken the entire North American continent. That cataclysm, huge and hideous, was smallpox. Now, let me do a quick poll of the room, just ask for a show of hands. How many of you all, raise your hand if you've got a mottled vaccination scar on, probably on your deltoid. Oh, man. So no, keep your hands up. Now look around. Those of you who don't have your hands up, you notice anything about? Right, okay. So we're older. We're older. Smallpox vaccination was dropped from the United States immunization protocol in 1972. So if you were born after 1972, odds are that you don't have a vaccination scar unless you did military service, say after 9/11, or unless you were part of a clinical trial or something like that. Smallpox was eradicated from the world in 1977. The eradication was certified complete by the World Health Organization in 1979. It's the only human disease that we have successfully eradicated. We have now eradicated a second disease, that is rinderpest, which is a cattle disease. At any rate, smallpox is caused by a moderately contagious orthopox virus known as variola major. It's transmitted almost exclusively through human-to-human contact, usually through some sort of contact with a sick person. The symptoms generally include headache, backache, fever, vomiting, malaise, followed then by this hideous rash. Now, victims are usually contagious from the onset of symptoms until the last scab falls off. This is a process that takes roughly 1 month. Now, if you contract variola major, your odds of dying are around 38%. And although survivors, like this little boy, are typically scarred and in severe cases can be blinded by this disease, they are also blessed. Having endured smallpox once, they are now immune. They can never catch it again. Now, most of you are undoubtedly familiar with this man, Edward Jenner, and with the story of his development of cowpox vaccination against smallpox in the year 1796. If you're not familiar with the story, this was an experiment that would never receive IRB approval today. And what Jenner did, Jenner observed that milkmaids who milked cows tended not to get smallpox. And he thought maybe it's because of their exposure to cowpox. So what he did was he found a 7-year-old boy, James Phipps, made an arrangement with his mother, and cut an incision in Phipps's hand or arm and implanted him with cowpox. He went through cowpox. Then after he had survived cowpox, which has minimal case fatality, Jenner tried to infect James Phipps with smallpox. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And therein lie the origins of vaccination, well, vaccination in general, and specifically smallpox vaccination. The key is that before 1796, vaccination was unknown. In spite of that, though, 18th century Americans still had 2 weapons that they used to fight smallpox. The first weapon was isolation, quarantine. That really needs no explanation. But the second weapon was variolation, which people at the time called inoculation. And it's important to understand that inoculation, as used for centuries before Jenner, was different from the vaccination that he developed. So inoculation is actually one of those areas in which Africa and Asia were well ahead of Europe. Europeans did not learn of inoculation until the year 1716. And when they did, at least in North America, they got their knowledge from an enslaved African. An African named Onesimus, who belonged to the Puritan minister Cotton Mather in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Onesimus was a Coromantee. He was probably from the central Sudan. And as you can imagine, an enslaved person who had survived smallpox and was therefore immune was more valuable than one who was vulnerable to smallpox. So one day, Cotton Mather approached Onesimus, and he said, "Onesimus, have you ever had smallpox?" And Onesimus looked at him and said, this is Mather's diary. He says, "Yes and no." And then he goes on to describe to Mather this procedure that his father had put him through in West Africa when he was a little boy, where his father had cut an incision in his hand, found smallpox patient, taken pustular matter from that smallpox patient, implanted it in Onesimus's hand. What happened? He developed smallpox, a mild case, survived it, garnered immunity, and reached adulthood with immunity to smallpox. So, unlike Jenner's vaccination, which utilized the cowpox virus, inoculation involves the deliberate infection of a susceptible individual with variola virus, with the smallpox virus, usually through an incision on the hand or the arm. It can be anywhere. And when this is done, as you'd predict, the patient comes down with smallpox. But inoculated smallpox is, in most cases, much less virulent than the so-called natural form of the disease. Survivors win lifelong immunity, just as they do from natural smallpox, but case fatality rates are significantly lower. Now, as with all good things, there's a catch. And the catch is that individuals under inoculation do come down with smallpox. And they are therefore fully capable of infecting others with the disease. So unless it's implemented under strict quarantine, this practice of variolation is really as likely to start an epidemic as to stop one. And for this and other reasons, it was extremely controversial in the English colonies. Now, back to the American Revolution. The first signs of an impending explosion of smallpox came in 1775 during the earliest conflicts of the Revolutionary War. And indeed, outbreaks of smallpox at Boston and Quebec in 1775 pushed General George Washington and his medical staff to make important policy decisions regarding smallpox control in the Continental Army, which I will get to in a second. Now, it should come as no surprise that epidemic smallpox surfaced first in the revolutionary hotbed of Boston. Think about what's going on here. With each new British action and colonial response, meetings convened, crowds gathered, messengers raced back and forth between the colonies. Isolated incidents of smallpox had occurred in towns around Boston through much of 1774, and by January of 1775, the disease had taken hold in Boston itself. So if you're looking at this map, and if you know Boston, this doesn't look familiar to you at all right? So this has all been backfilled today, Back Bay. But Boston at the time stuck out into Boston Harbor like a little, short-handled spoon. All right, so the city of Boston is right there. So the disease had taken hold in Boston itself by January of 1775. And then after Lexington and Concord, in April of 1775, as an episode known as the Siege of Boston got underway, the British, the citizens of Boston, and the smallpox virus were all trapped in the city together. They're basically trapped in the bowl of that little short-handled spoon while George Washington's Continental troops are surrounding them here, around the waters of Boston Harbor. So the disease festered in Boston through the summer of 1775. George Washington was extremely anxious that the pox might infect his own men surrounding the city. And in fact, any soldier showing, as he put it, the least symptoms of smallpox faced immediate quarantine. And I think it's important here to bear in mind Washington's personal experience. In the year 1751, when Washington was 19 years old, he'd actually taken a trip to Barbados. The reason for his trip to Barbados was to alleviate the persistent cough and congested lungs that afflicted his older half-brother, Lawrence, who traveled to Barbados with him. Lawrence had consumption or tuberculosis. And it was believed that a change of climate would cure, at least alleviate the symptoms of tuberculosis. So they go to Barbados in 1751, and what happens? George contracts smallpox. He became very, very sick, took to his bed for a full month, and survived. It raises questions about 18th century portraiture. We don't know how many smallpox scars he might have had and that artists covered up. But the larger point is that he had hard experience with this infection. He knew how it could incapacitate his army. And so that's why he was so assiduous about efforts at smallpox control during the Siege of Boston. And the American efforts at smallpox control were successful through the summer and fall of 1775. But then, in the first week of December 1775, 4 British deserters arrived at Washington's headquarters, coming out of Boston with alarming news. These British deserters said that the British command at Boston had deliberately infected several people and sent them out of the city to the American lines with a design to spread the smallpox among the troops. So Washington hears this, he can't believe it. But then when smallpox broke out among some of the refugees coming out of Boston, he revised his skepticism and he redoubled, the Americans redoubled their efforts at smallpox control. Now it's important to bear in mind here something that I call differential immunity. By the late 18th century, smallpox was endemic in Europe, meaning it was constantly present, the way many of us were exposed, say, to chickenpox or measles as kids. Odds are you would reach adulthood having been exposed to smallpox and having garnered immunity as a child. But in the Americas, smallpox was not endemic. So most Americans reached adulthood without exposure to this disease. And what this meant for the Revolutionary War was that British troops were, for the most part, immune to smallpox. American troops, by contrast, were vulnerable. At any rate, for the American troops at Boston, the efforts at smallpox control paid off. The disease did not spread among American forces until after the British withdrew from Boston on March 17, 1776. And then in the aftermath of the siege, people poured into the city, essentially adding fuel to the fire, to the epidemic that was already brewing there. The epidemic peaked in July of 1776, right? You can imagine the mass meetings and everything else, and it finally burned itself out in September of 1776. Now, events to the north were even more grim. In Canada, over that very same winter of 1775-76, some 1,900 American soldiers had besieged the British-held city of Quebec over the winter of 75 and 76. Now, we all know about the 13 colonies, right? This was an attempt to bring a 14th colony into the Revolutionary War. And it failed. It failed because of smallpox. So by spring of 1776, those American soldiers besieging Quebec were in terrible shape. On May 1st, 1776, 900 of those 1,900 troops outside of Quebec were sick with smallpox. That's May 1st, 1776. 5 days later, British reinforcements arrived, and the Americans began a desperate retreat up the St. Lawrence River. And now even the semblance of quarantine disappeared. Men in the full throes of smallpox struggled through knee-deep snow right alongside men who had never had the disease. Within days, the fleeing soldiers had begun arriving at Sorel, which is where the Richelieu River flows north into the St. Lawrence. And now, in a cruel twist, long-sought American reinforcements poured into Sorel. These newcomers were almost all vulnerable to smallpox. From Sorel, the retreat continued southward until the army paused at a little island called Ile aux Noix, near the north end of Lake Champlain. "My eyes never before beheld such a scene," wrote John Lacey of Pennsylvania, "nor do I ever desire to see such another. The lice and maggots seemed to vie with each other, were creeping in millions over the victims." The retreat continued southward down Lake Champlain, and it took until September of 1776 for that northern army to cleanse itself of smallpox. Today, the damage remains hard to assess, but it's likely that smallpox carried away at least 1,000 men during that Canadian campaign. Now, returning American soldiers caused havoc of their own, launching outbreaks in Connecticut and Pennsylvania that lasted well into 1777. So by 1778, this disease that had been so explosive in the early years of the American Revolution briefly faded away on the eastern seaboard. Why? Well, in part, the brief disappearance of smallpox was due to General Washington's decision to inoculate the Continental Army. This decision reflected Washington's recognition that the Revolution had brought about new circumstances in which people and contagious disease, just like ideas about liberty, circulated rapidly. In addition, Washington was concerned that his men might become the targets of British biological warfare. And his fears may have been justified. He had already heard those rumors of attempts to infect his army at Boston in 1775 and 1776. And then, in 1777, a British officer named Robert Donkin, stationed at British headquarters in New York City, published a strange little book called Military Collections and Remarks. And in a telling footnote, Major Donkin actually proposed biological warfare. And the text read as follows. You can read along with me. "Dip arrows in matter of smallpox and twang them at the American rebels in order to inoculate," he means infect them. "This would sooner disband these stubborn, ignorant, enthusiastic savages than any other compulsive measures. Such is their dread and fear of that disorder." Now, what's really interesting is what comes next. This is what makes doing history so fun. This footnote survives in only 3 known copies of the book. In all other copies, it has been carefully excised. When and by whom, we do not know. I would propose, however, the fact that only 3 copies escaped this excision suggests that it was done soon after publication, perhaps even at the request of British High Command. So the copy that you're looking at here, this is from the Clements Library at the University of Michigan. I know it looks like I took a black magic marker to this old book, but in fact, I had it photographed with a piece of black paper behind the excised text. At any rate, beginning in the spring of 1777 and continuing through the following winter, the American forces went through inoculation. This is one of the things that made Valley Forge so miserable. They were all going through inoculation. They were all going through smallpox, on top of the fact of having no food, no clothes, no shoes, the whole deal. The procedure did not always go well for the troops, but quarantine at least seems to have been secure. In the years that followed, Washington's forces were much less vulnerable than they had been. Others were not. And as the Revolutionary War moved southward, so too did smallpox. By mid-October 1779, the disease had erupted among the Creek Indians in central Alabama, and soon thereafter, variola reached the cities of Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. And in the 2 years that followed, it plagued the South right along with the war. Particularly hard hit were enslaved African Americans. African Americans who fled to freedom behind British lines as General Charles Cornwallis's army marched through the South. It kind of turns the revolution on its head to think about it in these terms. These African Americans who flee to freedom with the British fleeing their American masters. Cornwallis's march to Yorktown, this famous march north to Yorktown in Virginia in late 1781, may even have been marked by another attempt at biological warfare, as the British, in a truly heinous act, actually turned their guns against these ill, very sick African Americans to whom they had promised freedom, and now forced them back to their masters in order potentially to spread smallpox behind enemy lines. Now, obviously, these events were tragic. They nevertheless paled by comparison to smallpox's ravages elsewhere on the continent at the same time. In 1779, the variola virus moved westward with a vengeance. In the West, trade, the Spanish mission system, and once again warfare all joined together in transmitting this pestilence. So in August of 1779, after an 18-year hiatus, smallpox struck Mexico City. By December 27th, 1779, the disease had afflicted more than 44,000 people in the city. By the time it was over, early in 1780, an estimated 18,000 people had died. And even as it waned in the administrative hub of Mexico City, the pox began a devastating migration through other parts of New Spain. You know, Mexico City had such a huge population that it's almost as though it spread by centrifugal force. Moving northward, it killed 10,000 people in Guanajuato. We can track its movement actually through the records of Spanish missionaries. And we see smallpox identified in some, but regardless of whether smallpox is identified, we see this enormous spike in burials when this epidemic hits. Along the west coast of Mexico and in Baja California, it traveled northward with the settlers, believe it or not, who would ultimately found the city we know of as Los Angeles, marked here by San Gabriel Mission. These settlers landed on the Baja coastline at the town of Loreto. They immediately went into town, and the pox spread like lightning. According to a Spanish missionary, the epidemic wreaked hideous, almost unbelievable havoc among the native peoples of Baja. They did not suffer alone. By October 1780, the epidemic reached San Antonio in central Texas. Soon thereafter, it reached Santa Fe in New Mexico and began to spread among the Pueblo peoples here. The month of February 1781 was marked by terrible mortality, with burials at New Mexico missions spiking to more than 1,000. So in all, this epidemic killed more than 5,000 mission Indians in New Mexico. And if we had numbers for non-mission Indians and apostates, the totals would be much, much higher. Now, neighboring Comanche peoples were also hit hard. So the Comanches traded with New Mexico and lived on the plains of Texas and Oklahoma, ranging up into Colorado and Kansas. So in 1785, after this was all over, the Comanches told two visitors that smallpox had struck them, and 2/3 of them had died, from which had followed the total destruction of their nations. Now, the Comanches spread the disease too. Comanches were horse traders. They sold Spanish horses from the southern plains, from our area right here, really, to a more northerly people called the Shoshones. For the Shoshones and for other northerly tribes, the consequences of this were terrible. And we know this because of an account given to a Canadian fur trader by an old Indian named Socamapi. Socamapi actually lived with the Blackfeet, so the Blackfeet would have been up here. And Socamapi recalled how in the summer of 1781, the Blackfeet had raided a Shoshone village, probably in Montana or southern Alberta, Saskatchewan. The Blackfeet slashed through the Shoshone teepees. And then Socamapi reports all they found were the dead and the dying, each a mass of corruption. Soon thereafter, smallpox broke out among the Blackfeet. And before long, they communicated it to the Crees and the Assiniboine peoples with whom they traded on the Canadian plains. On October 22nd, 1781, the first Indian turned up with smallpox at a Hudson's Bay Company trading post on the North Saskatchewan River called Hudson House. So this is October of 1781. Just to remind you, this is the exact same time as Yorktown is happening. So this is all unfolding at once. You've got African Americans dying in Virginia of smallpox with the British turning their guns on them, Native Americans dying of smallpox in Canada. By early December of 1781, the sickness had reached Cumberland House, more than 120 miles downstream. And by June of 1782, smallpox had infected Indians trading at York Factory, 400 miles to the northeast on the shores of Hudson Bay. So the trading posts of the Canadian Shield, just like the missions of the Southwest, became deadly centers of contagious dispersal. The epidemic was equally devastating on the plains closer at hand to us. Along the Missouri River, in this area here, along the Missouri River, agricultural nations, such as the Mandans and Hidatzas, lived in these permanent, very densely populated settlements. The epidemic may have reached them by way of Crow middlemen, ferrying horses and goods to them from the Shoshones at the base of the mountains. 23 years later, Lewis and Clark mapped the empty Mandan villages wiped out by the epidemic. Now, as this epidemic raged among the Mandans and Hidatzas, a combined party of Cree, Assiniboine, and Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe warriors from Canada attacked them. So these were warriors from this area right here. They attacked the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, and they carried smallpox home with them to Lake Winnipeg, where it decimated their peoples. Lakota people, sometimes called Sioux, also appear to have picked up smallpox through their attacks on Mandans and Hidatzas. We know this because of archaeological evidence, and we also know this because Lakota winter counts. Winter counts were a way of recording the passage of time, recording Native American history. Each winter would be marked with a significant event. And Lakota winter counts, as you can see here, indicate that the tribe suffered from smallpox over 2 successive years. Now, recorded eyewitness accounts of this pestilence end at Hudson Bay and the northern plains. But the epidemic did not end there. It also struck the northwest coast. That's where we started out today, where George Vancouver observed its depopulating effects. The question is, how did it get to the northwest? We have no eyewitness accounts. And there were, in fact, several possible routes by which smallpox could have reached the northwest coast in the late 1770s or 1780s. And believe it or not, one possibility is that the source was Russia. I'm serious. No. Yeah, I'm sorry, okay. I get it, it's funny. In context, when I wrote that, it was not so funny. But by the late 1700s, Russians sailing east from Kamchatka, had developed a very active and very brutal trade with the natives of the Alaskan coast and the Aleutian Islands. And smallpox had wreaked havoc in Russia and then across Siberia and the Kamchatka Peninsula in 1768. This was an epidemic that actually infected Catherine the Great. In my view, this is the least likely scenario, among other reasons, just because the timing is too early. A second possibility is that the virus was carried to the northwest coast by one of several European voyages during this period. Here again, the evidence is less than convincing. So what is most likely, I think, is that the smallpox came from inland Shoshone peoples in 1781 and 82, probably by way of the Columbia River. Northwest coast natives had a robust trade inland. Archaeologists have found seashells from the Pacific in Idaho, in the very heart of Shoshone country, at the very origins of the Columbia River. So I believe that the Shoshones hold the key to explaining the epidemic's spread, not just on the northern plains, but also by way of the Snake and Columbia rivers to the northwest coast. Okay, I connected a lot of dots. Probably not the right metaphor for talking about smallpox. But why does this, what was the impact of this great wave of pestilence? Well, the implications were as varied as the regions that smallpox struck. In the East, smallpox was one of several things that combined to dash the dreams and aspirations of freedom-loving African Americans during the Revolutionary War. At the same time, smallpox control was an essential component of the American victory in the Revolution. Washington's order to inoculate his troops was one of the most important decisions of the war, keeping the infection at bay. In the Southwest, in our area right here, and in New Mexico, at the most visible level, the impact was twofold. The disease weakened the Comanche Indians so much that they made peace with the Spaniards. In addition, the precipitous population decline forced Spanish officials in New Mexico to contract the mission system on the northern frontier. Many missions were eliminated entirely. In Canada, the fur trade collapsed. York Factory, that post on the shores of Hudson Bay, was the Hudson Bay Company's largest, most profitable post. The trade there dropped from 26,000 made beaver, that was their way of accounting, dropped from 26,000 made beaver in 1781 to approximately 13,000 made beaver in 1782. And statistics like that suggest that the effects of this epidemic reverberated widely. Obviously, this was devastating to the native peoples of the Canadian Shield and Canadian Plains. By the same token, it was a great relief to the beaver who were being overhunted. We could explore the ecological effects, as they reverberate, across the continent. On the northern plains, those agricultural Mandans and Hidatzas, with their densely populated earth lodge villages, suffered many more losses than their nomadic Lakota enemies did. The Lakotas soon overran them, and they became the dominant tribe of the northern plains that westward-moving Anglo-Americans would encounter in the 19th century. And finally, this is related to what I just said, I think the events I've described indicate that by the time these Anglo-Americans arrived in the pristine American West, it in fact was not pristine at all. Thank you.
First question over here.
Is it true that 20 years before that, Lord Amherst had intentionally infected the Iroquois nations?
One piece of that is true. Yes. So what this gentleman is referring to is an incident that took place at Fort Pitt, currently the site of Pittsburgh, in 1763 during something called Pontiacs Rebellion. The Indians were not happy with the settlement of the French and Indian War. They rose up to resist the British. And British officials at Fort Pitt conveyed 2 blankets and a handkerchief, we have this in writing, from the smallpox hospital to native peoples who had come in for negotiations. And an eyewitness on the scene, a man named William Trent, wrote in his diary after they conveyed these items to the Native Americans. They were mostly Delawares and Shawnees, I believe, which would be Lenape and Shawnees. But this trader wrote in his diary, he said, "We hope it will have the desired effect." Yeah, pretty chilling words. And Jeffrey Amherst approved of that action. General Thomas Gage also approved of it. You know, it was approved up and down the British command. It's a pretty good indication of what British officials thought of native peoples. Yeah, like Shivington and Sand Creek.
The question over here.
Yes, throughout history, there's been a close interaction between the spread of infectious disease and war.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you'd comment further. I mean, what comes to mind is influenza during World War I, malaria during the Vietnam War, and not only affecting military populations, but civilian populations like measles outbreaks and civil wars in Africa. I'm wondering if you could comment more on that.
Yeah, I'm not a trained epidemiologist, but I became one in the course of doing this research. And warfare brings about the perfect storm. You know, bringing people from diverse immunological backgrounds with diverse microbial communities together in concentrated communities, and then spreading them out again. It creates massive upheavals. It creates refugees, you know, like African Americans during the Revolution, and it happens again and again. And again, you know, we have yellow fever in the Spanish-American War. You know, it's ubiquitous. It will happen again. It will have cholera is another. Yeah.
So I'm going to take the liberty of asking the next question. So I live in a little town on coastal Connecticut called Guilford, and when the English settlers arrived, it's not on. I think.
There you go.
Hold it closer. Okay. When the English settlers arrived in town, there were existing streets, there were stores of food, fields that were almost cultivated, and everyone in the town had died. And the Indian population there was probably in the thousands at its heyday. And the English were so grateful that all of this had been left to them because they were near destitute in their capabilities. And in town, we have a number of debates amongst ourselves whether this was indeed smallpox, if it was, where it came from, and also, was it true that that sort of initial population of Indians had less resistance? Was there greater fatality amongst our native peoples than amongst, for example, European sailors?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what many of those early epidemics were. I mean, even the Pilgrim settlement at Plymouth was settled on the site of an empty Patuxet village. And in fact, the Pilgrims raided Indian graves for food supplies and all, by virtue of an epidemic that had swept through there, and people are still arguing about what that epidemic is. We do know that smallpox hit New England in the 17th century. Now, whether it's the cause of the devastation that wiped out the Indians in the Guilford area, or whether it was a part of the Pequot War, which was right next to Guilford, where there was just, you know, English settlers attacked an Indian village and just massacred, burned people alive. Whether it was violence by way of disease or violence by, you know, more directly, I can't say. Yeah.
We had some more questions. I didn't want to terminate that.
So is it then fair, I'm sorry, this is Doug Paget. Is it then fair to say this is how the West was really won, or pre-won for Europeans?
It's a very, very big piece of it. Now, I want to be clear that this was not the first smallpox epidemic. This was not the last smallpox epidemic. There were others earlier that are harder to trace in the historical record. This is the first one that's not easy to trace, but easier to trace. But there's another terrible, terrible smallpox epidemic that swept the West in 1837-38 that wiped out thousands upon thousands of people. Yeah. So yes, this is, in large part, this is how the West was won.
Over here.
Yeah. So the question is about
the odds that it's
can
like
smallpox survive on a blanket? And the answer is not well, but yes. Smallpox survives on fomites, and we have cases, while smallpox still existed in the world, say in India, linens taken from a smallpox hospital to a laundry would convey smallpox to laundry workers. It does not survive well, and I think D.A. Henderson once told, who was the head of the eradication campaign, once told me, he said that he thinks the communicability of smallpox has been exaggerated, and communicability by fomite has been exaggerated, but it happens.
so they've showed that they can revive ancient viruses that are found in other things. So I guess I'm curious with DNA.
I'm a historian.
and things.
I can't answer that, and I know better to go. Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to thank Elizabeth for a very inspiring talk.
Thank you.